"Sign this before dessert," my future mother-in-law said, sliding a thick legal envelope across the polished mahogany table. Her smile never reached her eyes. She had no idea she was speaking to a 4-star Army general who had spent 3 decades making life-or-death decisions under pressure. I looked down at the envelope but didn't touch it. Instead, I picked up my coffee mug with both hands, partly because it was warm, and partly because I needed a second to steady myself. That Christmas Eve started long before I ever sat at the Brooks family's dining table. My name is Rebecca Carter, and at 52 years old I had spent more than half my life wearing the United States Army uniform. I served as a 4-star general at U.S. Northern Command in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Most people picture generals living glamorous lives filled with fancy dinners and political meetings. The truth isn't nearly that exciting. Most mornings began before sunrise. Coffee from the same dented travel mug I'd carried for years. A quick run around the base whenever my schedule allowed. Endless briefings, flights across the country, meetings that often stretched late into the evening. And every night, no matter where I happened to be, I called my younger sister back in Kansas to make sure she was doing all right. The Army gave me purpose. It also taught me something few civilians ever understand. Your rank belongs to the uniform. Your character belongs to you. Outside military installations, I rarely looked like someone with authority. No expensive handbags, no designer clothes, no flashy jewelry. The only ring I wore belonged to my late mother. It wasn't worth much money, but it meant everything to me. That habit probably explained why Daniel had never questioned my simple lifestyle. We met almost 2 years earlier at a veterans fundraising dinner in Denver. I attended in civilian clothes after speaking at another event nearby. Daniel was volunteering that evening through his construction company. He spilled coffee on my coat. I laughed. He apologized at least 10 times. Then he offered to buy me another cup. Looking back, it was probably the most ordinary beginning 2 people could have. Daniel Brooks was 42, kind, patient, and the type of man who always held doors open for strangers. He remembered birthdays, called his grandmother every Sunday afternoon, and could fix almost anything around the house. There was only one problem. He couldn't stand up to his parents. Not once during our relationship had I seen him openly disagree with them. At first, I thought he was simply respectful. Later, I realized there was a difference between respect and fear. Because of the confidential nature of my work, I never discussed my position outside secure environments. Daniel knew I worked at Peterson Space Force Base near Colorado Springs. He assumed I was an administrative clerk. I never corrected him. People often ask why. The answer is simple. When someone knows your title first, they rarely get to know you. I wanted someone to love Rebecca before they admired General Carter. Daniel proposed the weekend after Thanksgiving. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I told him I wanted one more Christmas together before making the biggest decision of our lives. He smiled. "I'll finally introduce you to my family." His excitement was genuine. Mine wasn't. I'd heard enough stories about his parents to know Christmas dinner might tell me more than 2 years of dating ever had. So I made a decision. I wasn't going to arrive looking like someone important. I pulled my oldest wool coat from the back of the closet. It had a tiny repair near one pocket where I'd stitched it years earlier after catching it on a fence. My boots were comfortable but well worn. I skipped the pearl earrings my sister always insisted made me look distinguished. Instead of buying an expensive bottle of wine, I baked oatmeal cookies using my mother's recipe and packed them inside a simple metal tin. Daniel frowned when he saw me. "You know, Mom usually goes all out." "I know. You could have worn something nicer." I smiled. "This is nice." He hesitated. "You don't have to impress them." "I don't plan to." The drive from our hotel outside Nashville to his parents' estate took about 40 minutes. Neighborhoods gradually changed from modest ranch homes to gated properties with long private driveways. The Brooks house looked like something from a holiday magazine. Stone columns, perfect landscaping, a 12-foot Christmas tree visible through the front window, 3 luxury SUVs parked outside. Professional lights covered nearly every inch of the roofline. Everything announced success before anyone even opened the front door. Elaine Brooks greeted us wearing a velvet emerald green dress and enough diamonds to light the hallway. She hugged Daniel tightly. Then she looked me up and down. It took less than 3 seconds. "Well," she said with a practiced smile, "you're certainly comfortable." Ashley laughed before I could answer. Richard Brooks shook my hand firmly. His grip was solid. His eyes quietly evaluated everything. The coat, the boots, the cookie tin, the old pickup truck sitting in the driveway. He didn't say anything, but he didn't have to. Dinner started pleasantly enough. The prime rib was excellent. The mashed potatoes tasted homemade. For nearly 15 minutes, everyone stayed on safe topics: football, weather, holiday travel. Then Elaine leaned toward me. "So Rebecca Daniel says you work in an office." "I do." "What exactly do you make?" "I handle administrative responsibilities." She smiled politely. "I meant your salary." Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside me. I answered honestly without giving classified information. "I earn enough to live comfortably," Ashley chuckled. "That's a very diplomatic answer." I smiled. "Old habit." Elaine wasn't finished. "Do you own your home?" "I do." "Any investments?" "A few." "What about retirement?" "I'm prepared." Each answer seemed to frustrate her because I refused to play the game she wanted. Finally, she asked the question she'd been building toward all evening. "Do you really think you're the right match for my son?" Silence settled over the dining room. I looked at Daniel. He stared at his plate. Not once did he speak. Something inside me shifted. I'd stood in command centers during national emergencies. I'd delivered terrible news to military families. I'd buried friends. Yet somehow that quiet moment hurt more than I expected. Not because his mother questioned my worth, because the man who promised to build a future with me couldn't find a single sentence to defend me. Dessert arrived. Apple pie, vanilla ice cream, fresh coffee. Elaine waited until everyone had taken their first bite. Then she reached beneath the table and placed a thick manila envelope beside my plate. She folded her hands neatly and smiled. "Rebecca," she said softly, "there's something important we'd like to discuss after dessert." For a few seconds, nobody spoke. The only sounds in the room were forks scraping against china and Bing Crosby singing softly from a speaker somewhere in the living room. Outside, snow drifted past the windows in slow, lazy flakes, making the Brooks estate look like the cover of a Christmas card. It was almost enough to make me forget the envelope sitting beside my plate. Almost. Elaine lifted her coffee cup with perfect composure. "Go ahead," she said. "Open it." I glanced at Daniel. He looked pale. His fingers tightened around his napkin, but he still didn't meet my eyes. I slid the envelope closer and carefully removed the documents inside. The paper was heavy, the kind expensive law firms like to use. The first page carried the logo of a Nashville legal office I'd actually recognized from government construction contracts. Interesting. Elaine hadn't put this together over the weekend. She had planned it. Weeks ago. Maybe longer. I calmly turned the first page, then the second, then the third. Every document had been professionally prepared. The language was formal, almost clinical. The proposal was simple. If I agreed to end my engagement to Daniel immediately, I would receive a certified cashier's check for $250,000. The Brooks family would also purchase a furnished condominium in my name, cover 6 months of living expenses, and require me never to contact Daniel again. The final page contained a strict confidentiality agreement. If I discussed the arrangement publicly, I'd owe substantial financial penalties. Ashley leaned back in her chair with a satisfied grin. Honestly, she said, "That's probably more money than you've ever seen sitting in one place." I looked up from the paperwork. "I've seen contracts before." She laughed. "I seriously doubt you've seen one like this." Richard finally spoke. His voice stayed calm. "This isn't personal." I almost smiled. "Whenever someone begins with those words, it's always personal." He folded his hands on the table. "Our family has spent 40 years building a reputation." He nodded toward Daniel. "Our son has opportunities ahead of him. Business, community leadership, political connections if he wants them someday." He paused. "We don't believe your background fits into that future." There it was. Not cruel. Not loud. Simply stated as though he were discussing weather forecasts. Elaine reached over and gently tapped the stack of papers. "We're trying to make this easier for everyone." "I see. You seem like a decent woman." "I appreciate that. But love doesn't always overcome practical realities." Ashley couldn't resist adding one more comment. "My brother deserves someone on his level." I looked at Daniel again. He finally spoke. "Mom," his voice barely carried across the table. "I don't think—" Elaine didn't even raise her voice. "Daniel." One word. That was all it took. He stopped talking. The silence that followed hurt far more than anything his family had said. I had spent 32 years leading soldiers. I'd watched young officers find courage under impossible circumstances. I'd seen frightened privates step forward while others froze. Courage rarely arrived without fear, but it always required a choice. Daniel had made his, not with words, with silence. I lowered my eyes back to the contract. For one dangerous moment, I considered reaching into my purse. Inside was my government identification. One glance would have changed everything. Richard would have stood. Ashley would have stopped laughing. Elaine would have suddenly remembered every polite manner she'd ever learned. But another voice inside me said something I'd repeated to countless junior officers over the years. Never make important decisions while angry. So I kept reading. Every page. Every clause. When I reached the signature section, Elaine slid an expensive fountain pen toward me. I think you'll find this is an extremely generous offer. I picked up the pen. Across the table, Ashley smiled triumphantly. Daniel stared at the floor. Richard remained expressionless. I signed exactly one page. Not the agreement. Only the acknowledgement confirming I had received the documents for review. Elaine frowned. You missed the signature page. No, I placed the pen beside the folder. I signed the receipt. I expected a decision tonight. I don't make important decisions without reading everything carefully. Richard nodded once. I suppose that's reasonable. Elaine looked disappointed. I'd appreciate your answer within 48 hours. You'll have it. I folded the documents neatly back into the envelope. Then I stood. Thank you for dinner. Daniel finally looked at me.
I'll walk you outside.
No. I forced a small smile. You stay with your family. He hesitated. I'm sorry. I wanted him to say more. I wanted him to stand up. To tell his parents they were wrong. To leave with me. Instead, those 2 words were all he offered. I'm sorry. I nodded politely. Merry Christmas. Outside, the cold December air hit my face like a splash of water. The Brooks house glowed behind me. Music. Laughter. Perfect decorations. It looked like happiness. Appearances can be remarkably convincing. I climbed into my old pickup truck and closed the door. The silence inside felt enormous. For several minutes, I simply sat there with both hands resting on the steering wheel. The tears came before I realized I was crying. Not dramatic sobs. Just quiet tears sliding down my cheeks. I had commanded thousands of soldiers. I had briefed presidents. I had buried friends who never came home. None of those moments had prepared me for discovering that the man I loved couldn't defend me across a dinner table. I wiped my eyes with the sleeve of my old coat. Get yourself together, Rebecca, I whispered. Tomorrow is another day. As if on cue, my secure government phone vibrated in the center console. Very few people had that number. I answered immediately. Carter. Good evening, General. It was my executive assistant calling from Washington. I'm sorry to interrupt Christmas Eve. Go ahead. I just wanted to confirm tomorrow's schedule. I glanced toward the brightly lit house. I'm listening. Transportation will arrive at your hotel at 700 hours. I'll be ready. The governor's office has confirmed attendance. What about the sponsors? They're seated in the front VIP section. I almost laughed. Of course they were. The keynote begins promptly at 9. I understand. And General... Yes. Merry Christmas. I smiled for the first time that evening. Merry Christmas to you, too. The call ended. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel. Tomorrow morning, I'd stand before thousands of veterans' military families, state leaders, and community members. The Brooks family would be sitting in the front row. They had no idea who I really was. And for one more night, I intended to keep it that way. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Daniel staring at his dinner plate while his mother tried to buy me out of his life. Around 4:30 in the morning, I gave up trying. Years in the Army had trained my body to function on very little sleep. Some mornings began after only 2 or 3 hours. Christmas morning wasn't any different. I made a pot of coffee in my hotel room, stood by the window, and watched the lights of downtown Nashville shimmer in the distance. The city looked peaceful. It was hard to believe that in just a few hours, everything Daniel's family believed about me would change. Not because I wanted revenge, because the truth has a way of arriving exactly when it's supposed to. At 6 o'clock, I opened the garment bag hanging in the closet. Inside was my Army service dress uniform. Even after all these years, putting it on never became routine. Each ribbon reminded me of people who had stood beside me. Some had retired. Some had passed away. Some never came home. I carefully adjusted the rows of ribbons across my chest before fastening the jacket. Finally, I pinned on the 4 silver stars. Those stars had taken more than 30 years to earn. Thousands of long days, countless missed birthdays, anniversaries spent overseas, Christmases celebrated inside command centers instead of around family tables. People often admired the rank. Few understood the cost. A black government sedan arrived exactly at 7. The driver, Sergeant Morales, stepped out before I reached the lobby. Merry Christmas, General. Merry Christmas, Sergeant. He opened the rear door. Ready for a busy morning? I smiled. When has it ever been anything else? He laughed. Fair point. The drive to the Nashville Convention Center took less than 20 minutes. Even before we arrived, I could see buses unloading veterans from across Tennessee. Older couples walked arm in arm. Vietnam veterans wearing faded unit caps. Korean War veterans moving slowly with canes, young soldiers carrying toddlers wrapped in winter coats. Military families looked the same everywhere. Different faces, same quiet strength. As the sedan stopped beside the secure entrance, a young captain hurried toward the car. "Good morning, General Carter." He saluted sharply. I returned the salute. "Morning, Captain." "We're honored to have you here, ma'am." He escorted me through a private hallway leading backstage. Staff members rushed in every direction. Volunteers checked seating charts. Television crews tested cameras. Someone adjusted microphones on stage. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through the backstage lounge. The governor arrived shortly after I did. We shook hands briefly. Then several Medal of Honor recipients joined us for photographs. It was all familiar. Ceremonies followed routines, schedules, protocols. Everything happened on time. At 8:45, the event coordinator approached. "We're ready whenever you are, General." I nodded. She handed me a printed program. I glanced toward the audience through the curtain. Nearly every seat was full. More than 2,000 people. Veterans, military families, state officials, business owners, community leaders. And there, front row, exactly where my assistant said they'd be. Richard Brooks sat confidently beside his wife. Elaine wore another elegant designer dress. Ashley was scrolling through her phone, barely paying attention. Daniel looked different, restless. His eyes wandered around the room instead of toward the stage, almost as if he expected someone. Then I noticed him freeze. He'd caught sight of me walking behind the curtain. Only part of my uniform was visible beneath my long military overcoat. He leaned toward Ashley. She glanced up. For a second, she looked confused. Then she smirked. "I guess she found a job here." I saw her mouth silently. "Maybe event security." Daniel didn't laugh. He simply kept staring. At precisely 9 o'clock, the lights dimmed. The room became silent. The master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice echoed throughout the ballroom, "thank you for joining us this Christmas morning as we honor the men and women who have served our nation." A series of introductions followed. The governor, local officials, veterans organizations. Then came the final announcement. "It is now my great honor to introduce today's keynote speaker." I took one slow breath. "Please welcome." A pause. "General Rebecca Carter, Commanding Officer, United States Army." The moment felt almost unreal. Every active duty service member in the room stood instantly. Hundreds of uniforms moved in perfect unison. Salutes rose across the ballroom. Veterans who could no longer stand placed their hands over their hearts. The applause began quietly, then grew louder and louder. I walked toward the stage without rushing. Not because I wanted attention, because soldiers never hurry into moments that matter. As I reached the podium, I looked across the audience. Daniel's mouth had fallen open. His event program slipped from his lap onto the floor. Ashley looked as though she'd forgotten how to breathe. Elaine's face had lost every trace of color. Richard remained perfectly still. Years in business had taught him to hide emotion, but not well enough. Even from the stage, I could see realization settling across his face. The woman they'd treated like she wasn't good enough had never needed anything they could offer. I could have looked directly at them. I didn't. Instead, I looked toward the veterans seated throughout the ballroom. "My fellow Americans," the room became completely quiet. "When people thank me for my service, I always tell them they're thanking the wrong person." A few smiles appeared. "I've worn this uniform for over 30 years. I've received promotions. I've accepted medals, but none of those things happened because of one person." I spoke about young soldiers who missed their children's first steps while serving overseas, about military spouses who quietly carried families through long deployments, about parents who waited for phone calls every night, about ordinary Americans whose names would never appear in history books, but whose sacrifices protected everyone else's ordinary lives. Then I paused. "There is something the Army teaches every leader." I rested both hands on the podium. "You can measure rank. You can measure wealth. You can measure success. But you cannot measure character until someone believes you have nothing to offer." The words weren't written in my prepared remarks. They simply came. I wasn't speaking to the Brooks family. I was speaking to everyone, including myself. When I finished, the room remained silent for one long second. Then someone began clapping. Another followed. Soon the applause filled the entire ballroom. It continued long after I stepped away from the microphone. Not because I was important. Because the people in that room understood exactly what I meant. As I exited the stage, I glanced once toward the front row. The Brooks family was gone. Their seats sat empty beneath the bright Christmas lights. For the first time since dinner the night before, I didn't feel victorious. I simply felt free. The first time Daniel called, I let it go to voicemail. The second time, I silenced my phone. By lunchtime, he'd called 7 times. There were also 4 text messages. Please let me explain. I know I failed you. I'm not asking you to forgive me, just let me talk to you. The last one simply read, I'll be at Harper's Coffee on Broadway until 3. If you don't come, I'll understand. I stared at the message for a long time. Part of me wanted to drive straight back to Colorado. Another part wanted answers. Not because I believed our relationship could be saved. Because I needed to hear what kind of man Daniel really was once his family's voices weren't filling the room. Around 1:30 that afternoon, I walked into Harper's Coffee. It was the kind of place I loved. Brick walls, old black and white photographs of downtown Nashville, fresh cinnamon rolls cooling behind the counter. A few older couples sat reading newspapers while Christmas music played softly overhead. Daniel was sitting alone near the back window. He looked like he hadn't slept. When he saw me, he stood so quickly he nearly knocked over his chair. Rebecca? I nodded. Sit down. He waited until I sat before lowering himself back into his seat. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he took a deep breath. I'm sorry. I stirred my coffee. I know. No, I mean really sorry. I know. I've never been so ashamed. I looked out the window at people carrying shopping bags through the cold December afternoon. I believe you. His eyes filled with hope. You do. I believe you're ashamed. The hope disappeared again. But shame and courage aren't the same thing. He lowered his head. I froze. I noticed. They've controlled my whole life. I noticed that too. He rubbed both hands across his face. You don't understand what it's like growing up in that house. I looked at him quietly. No, he blinked. I spent 32 years leading soldiers through situations where fear was completely reasonable. I leaned forward. Being afraid isn't what defines us. What we do while we're afraid. He didn't answer. Instead, he stared into his untouched coffee. After nearly a minute, he whispered something so quietly I almost missed it. If I'd known who you really were. There it was, the sentence I'd been expecting. I gently interrupted him before he could finish. No. He looked up. No. I shook my head. Don't say that. I was just trying to explain. I know. I folded my hands together. Daniel. My voice remained calm. If I had actually been an administrative clerk making $40,000 a year, I paused. Would you still have stayed silent? His mouth opened. Nothing came out. The silence answered the question more honestly than words ever could. I smiled sadly. That's why this isn't about my rank. He closed his eyes. I know. No. I shook my head again. I don't think you do. The contract didn't break my heart. I took a slow breath. You did? His shoulders collapsed. For the first time since we'd met 2 years earlier, I watched Daniel Brooks cry. Not loudly, not dramatically. Quiet tears. The kind that come when someone realizes they've become the person they promised themselves they'd never be. I loved you, he whispered. I know. I still do. I believe that too. He looked confused. Then why? Because love isn't enough. I stood. I needed a partner. I wanted to be. You wanted to be. I placed a $20 bill beside my coffee cup. But yesterday you chose to be someone else's son instead. Neither of us spoke again. I wished him well. Then I walked out into the cold afternoon. Over the next week, life returned to its normal rhythm. Or at least I tried to convince myself it had. I flew back to Colorado Springs. Briefings resumed. Meetings filled my calendar. Snow covered the parade grounds outside headquarters. The Army kept moving exactly as it always had. But outside the gates, another story was quietly unfolding. The Veterans Recognition Ceremony had been televised across Tennessee. Clips of my speech began appearing online. Veterans shared short videos. Military families quoted sections of my remarks. I didn't pay much attention. Public speaking had always been part of my job. Then something unexpected happened. 3 days after Christmas, my executive assistant walked into my office carrying a tablet. General, what is it? You may want to see this. She handed me the screen. A local Nashville television station was reporting on a story involving the Brooks family. Someone inside the law firm that had prepared Elaine's contract had anonymously contacted a reporter. The documents themselves weren't released. Attorney-client privilege protected that. But several employees confirmed that wealthy parents had attempted to pay their son's fiancé to disappear on Christmas Eve. Within hours, local journalists connected the timing with my appearance at the Veterans Ceremony. No one accused me of leaking anything, because I hadn't. The story simply found its own way into daylight. Community reaction was swift, not hysterical, not nationwide, just exactly what you'd expect in a city where reputation still mattered. A veterans charity quietly removed Richard Brooks's company from an upcoming fundraising project. A local business association postponed presenting him with a community leadership award. Several longtime clients announced they were reviewing future contracts. No government investigations. No dramatic headlines. Just people deciding they no longer wanted their names connected with his. Actions have consequences, especially in smaller communities. About 2 weeks later, I received an unexpected phone call. Richard Brooks. I almost didn't answer. Almost. General Carter. His voice sounded older, tired. I suppose I should have called sooner. Perhaps? I owe you an apology. I listened. Not because he deserved my attention. Because everyone deserves the opportunity to tell the truth at least once. I spent my entire life believing success meant surrounding myself with important people. He laughed bitterly. Turns out I couldn't even recognize integrity sitting across my own dinner table. I said nothing. There isn't an excuse. No. There never was. No, he sighed. My family isn't doing well. I wasn't surprised. I don't expect forgiveness. I appreciate your honesty. May I ask one favor? What is it? Please don't judge my son by my mistakes. I looked out my office window. Soldiers were crossing the parade field below. Each carried different responsibilities, different burdens, different futures. I won't. Because the truth was simple. Daniel hadn't become his father. Not yet. He'd simply failed the biggest test of his life. Whether he learned from it was now entirely up to him. January arrived with the kind of cold that settled into your bones. Colorado Springs looked different after Christmas. The decorations came down. Families returned to their routines. Snow remained piled along the roads, and every morning I drove through the gates at U.S. Northern Command before sunrise, just as I had done for years. Life in the Army had a way of moving forward whether your heart was ready or not. That was probably a blessing. The work kept my hands busy. The quiet moments were another story. Sometimes I'd catch myself reaching for my phone expecting one of Daniel's good morning texts. Other times I'd see a couple walking through downtown holding hands and wonder how something that had once felt so certain could disappear over the course of a single dinner. People imagine heartbreak as one dramatic moment. It isn't. It's hundreds of ordinary moments when you remember the future you thought you were building. About 3 weeks after Christmas, I received a handwritten letter. Not an email. Not a text message. A real letter. The return address belonged to Richard Brooks. Inside was a single page. The handwriting was neat but uneven, as if he'd rewritten it several times before finally mailing it. General Carter. I spent most of my life believing success meant protecting my family at any cost. Looking back now, I realize I confused protection with control. I judged you before I knew you. Worse, I encouraged my family to do the same. I've apologized to my son. Whether he forgives me is his decision. I hope you'll accept my apology even if nothing else can be repaired. Richard Brooks. I read the letter twice before folding it carefully. People can change. Not everyone does. But some do. 2 days later, Richard asked if we could meet. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We met at a small diner halfway between Nashville and Murfreesboro. No reporters, no lawyers, no family members. Just 2 people sharing coffee. Richard looked older than I remembered. Not physically. Emotionally. The confidence that had filled his dining room was gone. I appreciate you coming, he said. I was already passing through. That wasn't entirely true. He smiled faintly. I suppose generals are allowed little white lies once in a while. I actually laughed. So I've been told. For nearly an hour we talked. Not about contracts. Not about money. About life. About mistakes. About how easy it is to convince yourself you're doing the right thing when everyone around you agrees with you. Finally, he reached into his briefcase. I believe this belongs to you. He placed the same manila envelope on the table. The contract. The certified check. Untouched. I pushed it back toward him. It never belonged to me. You could cash it. I won't. I insist. No. He looked puzzled. Why? Because if I accepted it now, I'd be putting a price on something that was never for sale. He nodded slowly. I understand. I'm not sure you do. He waited. My dignity wasn't worth $250,000. It wasn't. It wasn't worth $2 million either. Neither of us spoke for a while. Finally, I said something I'd been thinking about for weeks. If you really want to make things right, he looked up. Find someone who needs help. He frowned. What do you mean? Use that money to change someone's life. He sat quietly. Then he smiled. That's a better idea than anything I would have come up with. As we stood to leave, he extended his hand. This time there was no judgment in his eyes, only humility. I hope someday my son becomes half the person you are. I shook his hand. I hope he becomes better. Daniel never stopped trying. Every few weeks another letter arrived. Sometimes it was only a page, sometimes several. He never made excuses again. He never blamed his parents again. He simply admitted the truth. He had failed. One snowy afternoon in February, he came to Colorado Springs. He didn't ask to come inside the base. He waited across the street at a small public park. I met him there. The mountains stood bright beneath a blue winter sky. Children laughed on a nearby sledding hill. Life carried on around us. "I won't keep you long," he said. "I know." He reached into his coat pocket. It wasn't an engagement ring. It wasn't flowers. Just a folded photograph. It showed us during our first camping trip in Rocky Mountain National Park. I remembered that weekend. We'd cooked hot dogs over a campfire. Gotten caught in an unexpected rainstorm. Laughed until we couldn't breathe. "I almost threw this away," he admitted. But I couldn't. I looked at the picture for a long moment before handing it back. "It was a good memory."
It was.
"I'll always be grateful for it." His eyes searched mine. "Is there really no chance?" I answered as gently as I could. "Daniel," he nodded before I finished. "I know." "No," I smiled sadly. "I don't think you do." He waited. "Marriage asks one question before any other." "What question?" "When the hardest moment comes." I paused. "Will you stand beside me?" The wind carried a few snowflakes between us. "You couldn't answer that question." He closed his eyes. "No, and until you can." I shook my head. "You shouldn't ask anyone to marry you." For a moment neither of us moved. Then he surprised me. Instead of arguing, instead of begging, he simply said, "Thank you." "For what?" "For telling me the truth." We hugged once, briefly. Then we walked in opposite directions. That was the last time I ever saw Daniel Brooks. A month later, I quietly made a donation to a nonprofit organization that built affordable housing for disabled veterans. I used my own money. Not Richard's, not the Brooks family's. Mine. No press release. No photographs. No speeches. Some things matter more when no one knows you've done them. New Year's had already come and gone, but one memory stayed with me. That night, I hadn't attended a formal military gala. Instead, I ate chili and cornbread in the base dining facility with soldiers pulling overnight duty. We laughed over burnt coffee, played cards between radio calls, talked about our families. It reminded me of something I'd learned long ago. The finest people I've ever known rarely introduced themselves by their titles. They introduced themselves by their actions. Looking back now, I don't think the greatest victory was watching the Brooks family realize who I was. It wasn't hearing applause at the veterans ceremony. It wasn't even walking away from a broken engagement. The greatest victory was refusing to let someone else's prejudice change the kind of person I wanted to be. People will always judge appearances. Some will measure your worth by your paycheck, your neighborhood, the car you drive, or the clothes you wear. But those measurements have never revealed the best parts of a human being. Character does, always. If this story reminded you that dignity matters more than appearances, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been judged before someone knew your real story? Feel free to share your experience. And if you enjoy thoughtful stories about courage, forgiveness, and quiet justice, I hope you'll join me again. In the end, the greatest threat had come from choices his own company had made years earlier. Life has a peculiar sense of balance. It rarely arrives on our schedule. But it often arrives. Spring came to Virginia. Cherry blossoms returned to Washington. The long gray days of winter slowly disappeared. One afternoon I received one final letter from Ethan. There was no plea for another chance. No dramatic declaration. Just a simple apology. He ended it with one sentence. "I hope one day someone loves you the way I should have." I folded the letter carefully and placed it with the others. Then I whispered something he would never hear. "I hope someone teaches you that courage isn't loud." A week later, I mailed every letter back to him in the same box. I included only a short handwritten note. "I forgive you. I sincerely hope you build a beautiful life, but it won't be with me." Sometimes forgiveness is the kindest gift you can give yourself. 6 months later, I retired from the Army. 20 years had passed faster than I'd ever imagined. The retirement ceremony was far smaller than the awards ceremony in January. Exactly the way I wanted it. Afterward, I packed my belongings into moving boxes. I left Northern Virginia and bought a small farmhouse outside Charlottesville. Nothing fancy. Just white fencing. A wraparound porch. A vegetable garden that produced far more tomatoes than one person could possibly eat. My nearest neighbor, Mrs. Parker, was 72 and baked blueberry muffins every Sunday morning. The hardware store owner learned my name after only 2 visits. People waved when they drove by. No one cared what rank I'd retired at. I loved that. I spent my mornings walking the property with a rescue dog named Charlie. Some afternoons I volunteered with organizations supporting military families adjusting to civilian life. Twice a month I mentored young women preparing for leadership roles in the army. Whenever one of them worried about proving herself, I always told her the same thing. Never shrink yourself just to make someone else comfortable. It wasn't advice I had learned in combat. It was something I learned around a Christmas dinner table. Looking back now, I don't think hiding my rank was ever the real lesson. The lesson was much simpler. Titles impress people. Money impresses people. Success impresses people. Character doesn't need to announce itself. It quietly reveals itself over time. So does the lack of it. Richard and Eleanor judged me before they knew me. Ethan failed me because he feared disappointing the people who had raised him. None of them expected the woman in the old wool coat to have anything worth respecting. But here's what I've come to believe. If respect only appears after someone discovers your title, your salary, your accomplishments, or your connections, it was never respect in the first place. It was admiration for what they hoped you could do for them. Real respect begins long before anyone knows what's printed on your business card or stitched onto your shoulders. These days, my happiest mornings begin with coffee on the porch while Charlie chases squirrels across the yard. Sometimes I think about that Christmas, not with bitterness, just gratitude. Because one difficult evening saved me from spending the rest of my life explaining my worth to people who had already decided it. And that's a marriage no one should enter. If my story reminded you of someone, or perhaps even of a lesson you've learned yourself, I hope you'll share it with someone who might need the reminder that dignity is never something another person gets to assign. And if you enjoy stories about quiet strength, second chances, and justice that comes without losing your integrity, I'd be honored if you joined me again next time. Take good care of yourself.